there's no accountability when it comes to the people that make the regulations. Here's a good example, just a personal example that we use that I was just thinking of. When we travel and we travel with bikes a lot, and TSA always goes through and they check our bike bags. And one of the things that they do is, and TSA, that they're out there to keep us safe. They're there for our safety. So we don't get hurt. And one of the things they invariably do is they leave one of the pockets in my bike bag unzipped. And it has tools and some other things in there to help put my bike together and things. And it just spreads all over the case. Right. And I think about that, so then we're like, well, what do we do? Who do we call to stop this from happening? Nobody. Imagine in a private, because there's no accountability. They don't care. I mean, imagine if the airlines were doing their own. I would call it XYZ Airlines, and I say, hey, when you guys checked my bags, you guys unzipped, you didn't zip up a pocket and everything was scattered in my bag. They would fix it because I'm their paying customer.
Yeah, that's right.
Or I would go somewhere else. With a government agency, TSA, for example, they're a monopoly. Right. You can go nowhere else.
That's right.
And you can't get a hold of anybody. There's no accountability. Nobody would get fired anyway. If you did get a hold of somebody, nothing would happen. Nothing would change.
And I think you can take that even one step further, that the private security operator for dealing with bikes or airport security, whatever, their objective, right, in a profit and loss system, they're trying to earn profits, avoid losses. How do they do that? By satisfying their customers, by coming up with the right amount of safety regulation and convenience that makes customers want to choose their airline or their airport over the other. What's the incentive of the TSA? Well, partly it's to increase the authority and span of control of the TSA. Mm-hmm. It's to generate employment for TSA officers. So the government regulators have an incentive to impose more and more burdensome regulation because that leads to a higher budget. That leads to greater employment, perks, benefits. They have a systematic incentive to exaggerate not only the harm they claim to be addressing, but also their effectiveness at alleviating that harm with no market test, no feedback, no accountability.
Yeah, right. It reminds me of another story too. When we talk about free markets, I was talking with a dairy farmer one time. I was in a duck blind hunting, and he was just a libertarian principle and believed in free markets. Except in the dairy industry, he didn't believe in free markets. They needed to be government regulation because there's a lot of dairy farmers out there that would kill people with their milk if the government wasn't regulating them. So I want your opinion on this. I'm going to state my opinion. This is how I responded to him. I'm like, well, they wouldn't kill people for very long because they wouldn't stay in business. And my whole argument with government regulation is you could make a very valid argument that the more government regulation there is in the industry, let's say the food industry, let's say the drug industry, it makes people wash their hands of their own responsibility to find out who is good and who is bad in the market. And they just say, well, gosh, I mean, this drug is FDA approved or the USDA put their stamp on this milk. It's got to be good. Whereas in the olden days, before these government regulators, what you would do is you would call your neighbor and say, hey, Mrs. Doe, mm-hmm. Where do you get your eggs? Oh, we buy them from Farmer Joe up the road, and they're really good. And or milk, or use any kind of commodity. You would talk to other people instead of looking to the government and saying, "Well, what did the government approve?" and thinking that that's safe. You could argue that more people could die based on a big food outbreak like the E. coli scare because the government approved this stuff. Whereas if it's a smaller organization where people are doing their own due diligence in a free market, not as many people are going to die because it's on a smaller scale. I mean, what's your comment?
I agree entirely with your analysis. I mean, a little bit of this is, a sort of a myopia or a blindness in our own area of expertise. I had a colleague who used to joke, a professor, a friend of mine, who used to say, well, I'm in favor of free markets in every industry except higher ed, where I want massive government subsidies, to bump up my salary. Some of it's that. But you raise a really interesting point, Shawn. And it's, the way regulation is typically described in the textbooks and so forth is, the businesses being regulated will always want less regulation because that keeps them from making, a quick buck. In fact, if you look at the history of regulation and then you think theoretically about it, we see there are many cases where some kinds of companies actually prefer more regulation because it gives them an advantage relative to other companies in the market.